The starship Valiant came out of hyperspace and found itself surrounded by strange crystal structures that glowed with ancient power, and Captain Lauren Hayes stared at her screen in shock because the sensors were showing impossible readings that made no sense according to any physics. She knew her communications officer spoke with a shaking voice and said they were being hailed, but the signal was not coming from any normal technology. And what appeared on the view screen made everyone on the bridge hold their breath. A woman stood before them. But she was not just any woman, because she had silver hair that seemed to hold actual starlight flowing down past her waist, and her eyes were violet and ancient beyond any measure, and she looked at the human ship with careful attention, like a gardener examining an unwanted plant in her special garden behind her in the darkness of space. Self was a dragon, and it was absolutely real, with scales that shifted between deep red and shadow black, and each scale was the size of a small ship, and wings that could block out stars were folded against its long body, and eyes like molten gold stared at the Valiant with the intelligence of a predator. The woman spoke, and her voice traveled through empty space as if the void itself chose to carry her words, and she said her name was Silvera Nightwhisper, and she was the warden of the forbidden reaches and keeper of seals that held back darkness between realms, and the humans had entered her domain without permission. She explained that the dragon was named Ember, and he had been her companion since the first age of her world, and together they had guarded these gates for 3,000 years. Lauren fought to keep her voice steady, and said they were explorers from Earth seeking peaceful contact with other species, and they meant no harm or intrusion into this space. Silvera narrowed her violet eyes and said she knew of humans and called them the young species that spread across stars like wildfire, consuming and questioning and never stopping, and she told them they did not know what lay beyond this threshold or the ancient evils she held back, or the horrors that would make human wars look like games played by children. Lauren immediately offered to leave and said they wanted no conflict with the warden, but Silvera said it was too late because their arrival had already been noticed, and the seal was weakening, and something was stirring in the deep dark, and it had waited for thousands of years for any crack in her defenses. And now, because of the human intrusion, war was coming whether they wanted it or not. In the distance behind Silvera, space itself began to tear open like a wound. The breach opened like a cut in reality, and from it poured things that should not exist, and they were shadow given form and hunger, and the Valiant censors just labeled them as unknown hostiles because human language had no proper words for what the crew was seeing. Silvera moved with speed that seemed impossible, and her hands wove patterns in space that left trails of silver light and ancient words in a language older than human civilization spilled from her lips, and barriers of pure magical force appeared around the breach, but there were too many creatures, and the seal she had kept for 3,000 years had been broken. Ember roared, and the sound traveled through vacuum and hull and vibrated in the bones of every person on the Valiant, and the dragon launched forward with cosmic flame erupting from its jaws in colors that had no names, and shadow creatures dissolved in that ancient fire, but dozens more came through to replace them. Lieutenant Amy Grant asked what their orders were, and her hands hovered over weapons that seemed laughable against what they faced. Lauren watched Silvera fight, and the elf woman moved like water flowing and lightning striking, and her magic tore through enemies that normal weapons could not touch. But she was being overwhelmed, and she had held this line alone with only her dragon for 3,000 years, and humans had broken it in minutes through simple, ignorant trespass. The captain made a decision that would change everything. She ordered all hands to battle stations and told Tactical to focus every weapon on the breaches, and told the science team to analyze Silvera energy signatures and find ways to boost them, and told engineering to send all extra power to forward shields because they were going into the fight. Her first officer, Katie Morgan, quietly said this was not their fight. Laron replied it became their fight the moment they broke that seal, and besides, Silvera had been holding back literal hell for 3,000 years, and if she fell, that darkness would not stop here, but would spread to colonies and trade routes and to Earth itself, and she would be damned if she let someone who fought alone for 3,000 years fall because humans did not have courage to stand with her. The Valiant surged forward with all weapons, firing Silvera eyes went wide with surprise as human missiles and energy beams tore through the shadow creatures surrounding her. And she spun around, seeing the Earth vessel charging into battle, and for the first time in centuries, something like hope flickered across her ancient face. She whispered that humans were foolish. But brave, foolish humans Ember banked hard and circled around to protect the valiant flank, and in that moment an alliance was born in fire and desperation, with the Elf Warden and her dragon companion and humanity standing together against the dark. Between stars, but the breach was still growing, and from its depths something massive was beginning to emerge. What came through the breach made the previous shadow creatures look like small scouts, and it was vast with tentacles and eyes and shapes that hurt to look at, and it existed partly in their dimension and partly in others. And the valiant sensors could not establish a size because the thing seemed to shift. Between measurements, Ilver breathed out words, and for the first time, Lauren heard fear in her voice as the Warden said the name Devourer, and said she had hoped it was only legend. Katie asked if that was bad. Silvara replied through the communication link she had made with the Valiant, and said that thing had destroyed her homeworld. Civilization 3,000 years ago, and it had consumed entire continents before they managed to seal it beyond the veil, and she had spent 3,000 years making sure it never returned, and now it was Hirtha. Devourer reached to reward them with arms that seemed to bend space around them, and Ember met the attack with cosmic fire, but the flames just disappeared into the creature mass and were swallowed without effect, and the dragon roared in frustration. Reported from Tactical that their weapons were not even scratching it, and whatever that thing was made of, it was not matter as humans understood it. Lauren mind raced because Silvara had kept this thing locked away for 3,000 years, so there had to be a way to seal it again, but the breach was too wide, and the Warden was exhausted from constant vigilance. Followed by sudden battle, Lauren asked Silvera what she needed to close the breach. Silvera replied while breathing hard that she needed time and power, and most importantly, a sacrifice large enough to anchor the seal, and she looked at the Valiant. And Lauren saw calculation in those ancient eyes, and the Warden explained that a vessel power core detonated at the breach heart with her magic. Channeled through it would create a pulse strong enough to force the tier closed, but the ship would be destroyed and anyone aboard would die. Lauren said no. And there had to be another way, Silvara said quietly. There was not, and this was how it had always been, and this was why Wardens existed, to make the choices that must be made. But Lieutenant Amy was already pulling up ship designs, and her fingers flew across her console. And she said they could separate the engine section and set it to overload and let the main section retreat, and it would take precision timing and they would be burning all escape routes, but it might work. Katie finished the thought and said they would be stranded in deep space. But alive Silvera studied them with an expression that was hard to read and asked if they would sacrifice their means of escape and strand themselves far from any help for a universe they knew little about, and for a Warden they met only hours ago. Aaron said simply that Silvera had been fighting alone for 3,000 years, and it was time someone fought with her. Something changed in Silvera's expression, and the ancient wariness shadowing her features seemed to lift just slightly, and she straightened with power gathering around her. Invisible waves of silver light, she said, very well, and they would show this ancient evil. What happens when humanity stands alongside old guardians? And she looked too. Ember and the dragon roared agreement and told them to prepare the vessel. The Devourer surged forward with reality warping around its mass. The bridge shook as the Devourer appendage struck the Valiant shields in warning. Alarms screamed through every deck, and Engineering Chief Nicole Harper voice came through tense but controlled, saying separation sequence was ready and core overload would reach critical in 90 seconds once she started it. Lauren said understood and looked at Silvera image on the view screen and said they were ready. Elf Warden nodded and began to chant in that ancient language that made space itself seem to vibrate, and around her geometric patterns of pure light appeared, growing larger and more complex with each word, and they were beautiful and terrible at once. Ember flew in a wide arc trailing cosmic fire that connected to Silvera spell circles. creating a massive three-dimensional array of magic and dragon flame that surrounded the breach, and the Devourer thrashed against the forming cage as its alien intelligence recognized the trap Lauren ordered. To start core overload and told all hands to brace for separation. The Valiant shuddered as its engine section began emergency detachment, and mechanical clamps released with explosive bolts, and the main section pulled away just as the back segment reactor began its cascade. Failure, Lauren shouted for Silvera to act now, though. Elfwoman thrust her hands forward, and every spell circle she had created blazed with blinding light and ember, pouring ancient power through the magical array, and the Valiant overloading reactor became the focal point of forces older than human civilization. The explosion that followed was not nuclear or chemical, but something far older and stranger in the reactor. Energy channeled through Silvera magic and amplified by Ember cosmic fire became a pulse of pure sealing force, and it struck the breach like a hammer, and reality itself screamed. The Devourer was caught mid-lunge, half in their dimension and half beyond, and it thrashed with tentacles. Flailing, but Silvera's spell held firm, and the ancient patterns tightened like chains, and with a sound that was felt rather than heard, the breach began to close. Silvera said through gritted teeth that she needed more power. Cotty looked at Lauren and said they still had emergency generators. And if they overloaded those, Lauren ordered it done. Without hesitation, one by one, the Valiant backup systems were pushed past limits and detonated at the breach edge, and each explosion fed Silvera's spell, and each time the tier in reality closed. A little more, and the Devourer roars became distorted as it was forced back into the space between dimensions. With one last surge of power, the breach sealed completely. Silence fell across the battlefield, and shadow creatures dissolved without the tier sustaining them, and the Devourer's final scream echoed across dimensions and faded to nothing, and where the breach had been only clean empty sealed space remained. Silva slumped and caught herself against Ember's massive head, and the dragon nuzzled her gently with concern, and she managed a weak smile and turned to face the crippled Valiant. Drifting in space with no engines and minimal power, she said with wonder in her voice that they actually did it, and called humans foolish and magnificent, and said they actually helped close the breach. Lauren collapsed into her captain chair and let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like hours, and said they had a good teacher. Nicole's voice came through strained, saying she hated to interrupt, but they were dead in space, and life support had maybe 48 hours, and they had no engines and no way home, and were further from Earth than any human had ever been. The victory feeling died, and they had won the battle, but stranded themselves in the depths of space, and rescue would take months, and they did not have months. Silvera seemed to understand from their expressions and looked at Ember, then back at the Valiant, and determination settled over her features. Said they stood with her when they had no reason to, and sacrificed their ship to seal a threat they barely understood to protect a universe they had only begun exploring, and they had shown her something she thought lost 3,000 years ago. And that was hope that she did not have to stand alone. Lauren asked what she was saying. Silvera smiled, and it transformed her ancient face, and said that wardens do not abandon their allies, and she and Ember would get them home, and perhaps when they recovered they might discuss a more permanent arrangement. 3 months later, the Valiant limped into Earth's orbit, towed by forces that made every scientist at mission control question reality, and Silvera and Ember had kept their word, using ancient magic to sustain the ship and guide it across distances that should have taken years. The meeting with commanders took weeks, and Admiral Helen Carter listened with growing disbelief as Lauren and crew described what they encountered and fought at, and most importantly, what still lurked beyond the edges of known space. The Admiral said slowly that there had been a 3,000-year-old elf woman and her dragon standing guard over cosmic horrors the entire time, and humans never knew. Lauren corrected her and said not just Silvera, and after they closed the breach, the warden explained, there were others like her scattered across the galaxy, and they were wardens of different species and origins, and each guarded their own sectors of the boundary between reality and darkness beyond. And Silvera had been alone in her sector since her homeworld fell, but others were still out there watching and waiting and fighting battles humans never knew existed, Katie stepped forward and said the wardens wanted to meet humanity formally, and Silvera had been sending messages through channels humans could not detect, and she said the other wardens were curious about a species that would charge into a fight against cosmic horrors to help a stranger. Amy added that Silvera believed the devourer appearance was not random, and something was pushing against the seals and testing them. And breaches were becoming more frequent across multiple sectors, and the wardens were struggling to maintain barriers they had held for thousands of years. Admiral Carter asked what that meant. Lauren said, the wardens were offering humans a choice to go back to exploring their little corner of known space and pretend they did not learn what they learned, or they could stand with the wardens and help guard the barriers and become wardens themselves. The Admiral eyebrows rose and asked what humans could possibly offer beings who had guarded reality for thousands of years. Silvera's voice spoke from the speakers, startling everyone. And the elf woman said humans offered something the wardens had lost, and that was hope and adaptability, an ability to find new solutions to ancient problems. And Captain Lauren thought of separating her ship when Silvera saw only total sacrifice, and Engineer Nicole found ways to amplify magic using human technology, and humanity looked at the impossible and asked how to make it work rather than accepting it could not be done. Admiral Carter studied reports and charts and finally said if they did this, they would need proper protocol and training and understanding of cosmic threats and building ships that could fight alongside wardens instead of just being convenient bombs. And she looked at Lauren and asked if she was willing to go back out there. Lauren did not hesitate and said yes. 6 months later, Lauren stood on bridge of a new ship purpose-built to fight things that should not exist, with a crew trained in both conventional tactics and ancient warding techniques. Beside her stood Silvera, no longer alone after 3,000 years, and on the view screen, other wardens appeared one by one, including a crystalline being older than Earth and feline warriors in a construct of living metal, and each had fought alone so long they forgot what allies felt like. The crystalline warden said the council was gathered, and they stood at a crossroads because barriers weakened and ancient enemies pressed closer, and for the first time in recorded history, the seals might all fail at once. Silvera added that for the first time in recorded history, they did not stand alone because humanity had chosen to join them and shown that new blood and new ideas could make old guardians remember hope. And she looked at Lauren with something like pride. Lauren stood aware her words would be heard across the galaxy by beings ancient when her species was young. She said clearly that humans offered what they always offered, and that was a refusal to accept any fight was unwinnable, and stubbornness to stand when wisdom said to flee, and ingenuity to find solutions where only problems existed before. And she smiled and said the wardens had been guarding humanity without humans knowing, and now they returned the favor, and the wardens would never fight alone again. In darkness beyond the barriers, ancient evils stirred, but for the first time in thousands of years they faced something new, and not just lone wardens holding impossible lines, but an alliance of old guardians with ancient power. An experience combined with humanity and their fresh perspectives and determination to protect what they loved. The deadliest species in the galaxy had not been challenged, but had chosen a side. And the darkness had just learned what happens when humanity decides something is worth fighting for.